There is a moment in certain people's lives, and when I say certain people, I'm not being poetic, I'm being precise, when something stops. Not the heart, not breathing, something deeper than that. Something you never knew how to name, but that you always felt pulsing silently inside you like an old wound that never completely healed. Have you ever had the feeling that you were living a life that wasn't completely yours? I am not talking about common dissatisfaction. I'm not talking about that restlessness that anyone feels on a Monday at work. I'm talking about something much more subtle and much more devastating. The feeling that you were born with a perception of the world that no one around you seems to share, that you feel what others pretend not to feel, that you carry the weight of what no one wants to look at. One, that you've spent entire years trying to fit into spaces that were built for people who are fundamentally different from you. If you recognize that feeling, then this video didn't come to you by accident. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche and came to a conclusion that few had the courage to accept. There are souls that are born with a different porosity, an opening to the collective unconscious that makes them at once extraordinarily sensitive and extraordinarily vulnerable. He did not call these people weak. He called them rare. And rarity, as he himself wrote, always has a price paid in solitude. You paid that price, didn't you? You smiled when you wanted to cry. You held it when you wanted to let go. You remained when your soul screamed to leave. You bent into ways that hurt, not because you were weak, but because a part of you still believed that if you were good enough, careful enough, silent enough, the world around you would find peace, and you would find your place in it. But the place never arrived, did it? And here's what no one told you. This was not a defect of yours. It was a sign. It was your unconscious. That voice older and wiser than the rational mind, trying to tell you that you were built for a different journey. Not an easier journey, but a truer journey. Jung called this process individuation. It is not an abstract concept. It is the most accurate description of what happens when a soul finally stops trying to be what others need it to be and begins, trembling, afraid, a strange, unmistakable sense of arrival, to become what it has always been. And that's exactly what will happen here. This video was made for a specific type of person, for those who have been through enough to know that true transformation has no manual, for the one who has tried so many times to find answers on the outside, in relationships, in validations, in achievements, and who begins to feel, even if timidly, even if suspiciously, that the answer has always been elsewhere, deeper, quieter, darker, and at the same time brighter than anything the outside world could offer. By the time you're done with this video, something about you will have changed. I'm not going to ask you to believe that right now. I just ask you to stay, because this video needs to find you. And then, whatever happens inside you, tell no one. The soul that always felt too much and learned to hide it from the world. There was something about you, from a very early age. No, that was different. Not unlike the way people celebrate. Not unlike in a way that generated applause or admiration. Different in a way that generated discomfort in others. And over time, on yourself. Do you remember being a child and feeling the weight of an adult's silence before they even opened their mouths? Do you remember walking into an environment and immediately picking up on something that was wrong, an invisible tension, an unspoken sadness, an anger masquerading as normalcy, while everyone around you moved on as if nothing existed? Do you remember crying for something that wasn't even yours, for a pain that didn't belong to you, but that you felt like it was? This was not weakness. That was perception. Carl Jung described the human psyche as an iceberg, the visible part, what we show the world, the roles we play, and the masks we wear, he called the persona. But beneath the surface, vast and silent and immense, there is what he called the unconscious, and there are souls who are born with the membrane between these two worlds extraordinarily thin. Souls who feel what is below when everyone else can only see what is on the surface. You are one of those souls. And for years, maybe decades, you didn't know what to do with it. Because the world was not built for those who feel this way. The world was built for efficiency, for speed, for productivity, for the surface. The world rewards those who can disconnect, who can separate, who can move forward without looking to the sides. And you never managed to do that. You always looked to the sides. You always felt the sides. You always carried the sides with you, even when no one had asked for it. And then you learned to hide. It was not a conscious decision, it was an adaptation. The human psyche is extraordinarily creative when it comes to survival, and you have survived by learning to bend that sensitivity inward, to pack that perception into layers of silence, of humor, of excessive kindness, of hyper-competence, of care for everyone around you except yourself. You've become very good at looking good, so good that people around you began to believe that you were always fine. And then they began to bring you that which they were not able to carry, because you looked strong, because you seemed capable, because there was something about you that conveyed the silent message that you had room for more, that you could take more, that you were the kind of person who didn't break. But you broke, but inside, but alone. But at times when no one was looking, Jung had a name for this division. He called it shadow dissociation. Not the shadow that scares, but the shadow that guards. The part of you that was pushed down because the world around you had no vocabulary for it, no tolerance for it, no room for it. And the more you hid it, the more it grew. Not angry, with weight. The weight you carry today is not accumulated weakness. It is sensitivity denied. And here's what very few people understand about this kind of soul. Hiding wasn't a mistake. It was the only way you found to continue existing in a world that didn't know what to do with what you were. You don't have to be ashamed of it. You survived. And surviving, when you are built the way you are, requires a courage that most people will never need to have. But surviving is not the same as living. And at some point, which may be exactly this moment, the soul that has spent years hiding begins to feel that the hiding place has become too small, that the walls you built to protect yourself began to imprison you, that the mask you donned to belong to began to weigh more than the isolation it intended to avoid. This discomfort that you are feeling, this restlessness that has brought you here, is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something is starting to get right. The weight you carried in place of people who never asked for your healing. There is a silent pattern that runs through the life of almost every sensitive soul, and it is so natural, so embodied, so invisible to those who live it, that it is rarely recognized by its name. You've spent years taking care of people who never asked you to do it. Not literally, of course. No one has come to you with a contract. No one said out loud, "I need you to carry my pain so I don't have to carry it." But it happened anyway. It happened in the way that you instinctively knew when someone was down before any words were spoken. It happened in the way you adjusted your mood so as not to worsen the mood of an environment. It happened in the way you held your own sadness to have space to welcome the sadness of others. It happened in the way you became, without anyone having planned it, the emotional balance of people who were not willing to find their own. Jung described something he called the function of psychic containment. It is the phenomenon by which a more permeable, more open, a more sensitive psyche begins to absorb and process what the surrounding psyches cannot or do not want to process. It is not a metaphor. It's a real process. It's what happens when you walk away from a conversation with someone and feel inexplicably exhausted when nothing physically taxing has occurred. It's what happens when you come into contact with another person's distress and it seems to diminish in them as it grows in you. You weren't imagining that. This was happening. And the cruelest thing about this dynamic is not the fatigue it generates, although fatigue is real and deep and often confused with laziness or lack of motivation. The cruelest thing is what it does to its perception of itself over time. When you spend years being other people's emotional vessel, you start to lose track of where what's theirs ends and what's yours begins. You wake up in the morning and feel a weight that you don't know how to name, and you can't tell if this weight is your sadness or the residue of everything you absorbed the day before. You start to have a hard time identifying what you genuinely want, what you genuinely feel, what genuinely makes you feel good, because for so long, your internal system was completely turned outward, mapping the needs of others, adjusting to the pains of others, managing the emotional worlds of others. You have lost touch with your own inner self. And the most devastating thing is that, in the midst of all this, There was a belief that you never named, but that was always there. The belief that if you took care of yourself well enough, if you loved deeply enough, if you were present enough, the people around you would heal. And this healing of theirs would be, in some way, yours too. But they were not cured, or they were cured and left, or they stayed and continued to need it. And you continued to give what you didn't have as replacement. You continued to give up yourself in the name of a cure that never became yours. Jung was absolutely clear about this. No human being can heal another human being who has not decided to heal himself. The process of individuation, the journey toward the true self, is non-transferable. You can't do it for anyone. And when you try, what you offer is not a cure. It is codependency disguised as love. That doesn't mean you're guilty. It means that you were taught, by example or lack of example, that your worth was directly linked to your usefulness to others. What that being needed was the surest way to be loved. That if you stopped caring, stopped being available, the love you needed so much would simply disappear. And then you never stopped. Until now. The shadow Jung saw in you before you could look yourself. There's a part of you that you've spent your whole life trying not to be. Maybe you don't even know exactly what this part is. Maybe it shows up as an anger that you quickly quell before anyone can see it. Perhaps it appears as a desire to be left completely alone, a desire to disappear from all obligations and expectations, which you immediately condemn in yourself as selfishness. Perhaps it appears as a coldness you occasionally feel towards people you supposedly love, an emotional exhaustion so deep that for a brief moment you feel nothing. And it terrifies you because you believe that feeling nothing is the opposite of who you are. Jung called all this a shadow, not in the sense of evil, not in the sense of something that needs to be destroyed or eliminated or exorcised. The shadow in Jungian psychology is simply the repository of everything that has been rejected, everything that was considered unacceptable, dangerous, inadequate, shameful. Everything that you, at some point in your life, received the message that you could not be, could not feel, could not show. For a sensitive soul, shadow is often constructed of very specific materials. The anger you couldn't feel because anger was aggression and you didn't want to be aggressive. The limit you couldn't impose because limits were selfishness and you didn't want to be selfish. The healthy indifference that you could not exercise because indifference was cruelty and you never wanted to be cruel. The rest you couldn't take because rest was laziness, and you had learned that your value was in your emotional productivity for others. And so, over the years, you have been building a huge shadow, not of addictions or cruelties, but of legitimate human needs that have been systematically pushed down. The problem with the shadow is not that it exists. The problem is what happens when it's ignored for too long. Jung described this phenomenon with a precision that spans generations. What you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as destiny. In other words, the parts of you that you refuse to see, to integrate, to recognize as your own, do not disappear. They find other ways to manifest themselves. They appear in the patterns of relationships that are repeated. They show up in the kind of people you keep attracting. They appear in chronic burnout that does not have an identifiable medical cause. They appear in the feeling that you are always on the verge of something you cannot name. Do you recognize any of these patterns? The integration of the shadow is not a dramatic process. It doesn't require you to become someone else. It requires something much more difficult and much more transformative. It requires you to look at the parts of yourself that have been exiled and say, perhaps for the first time, that they are also part of you, that your anger doesn't make you a monster, that your limits don't make you cruel, that your rest does not make you unworthy, that your need for space doesn't make you selfish, that you whole, trying with everything that has been hidden and everything that has been shown, are worthy of existing. Jung wrote that finding one's own shadow is equivalent to finding 80% of a lifetime's spiritual journey, not because the shadow is the most important part, but because it is the most denied part. And that which is most strongly denied is exactly that which contains the most energy for transformation. Within your shadow is not just the pain you have hidden, there is also the strength that you have not yet used, the moment when the old identity begins to die, and why it's sacred. There is a moment, and when it arrives, you recognize, even if you have no words for it, when the life you have built for yourself begins to look like a costume that no longer fits. Not because life is objectively bad, not because the people around you are necessarily toxic, not because your achievements are fake or your relationships are worthless, but because something inside you has changed in size. And the container that has worked for years, the identity you've so carefully constructed, the version of yourself you've learned to be accepted, can no longer contain what you're becoming. This moment of acute discomfort, this crisis that has no clear name, this feeling that something has ended without anything having visibly ended, Jung called symbolic death. And he was absolutely accurate in calling it death. Because that's what it is. The old identity doesn't turn smoothly into a new one. She dies. It resists death. She negotiates. She begs. She tries to convince you that transformation is not necessary, that the discomfort will pass, how more that you can continue to be who you were if you just try a little harder, if you just adapt a little more, if you just hold on a little longer. But you already know, somewhere that is deeper than any thought, that you can't. Ancient cultures understood this in a way that modernity has almost completely lost. The rites of passage and practically all the spiritual traditions of the world had in common one element: the symbolic death of the initiate. Before becoming what one was meant to be, the individual had to go through an experience of dissolution, of loss of self, of descent into what the Greeks called katabasis, the journey to the underworld, not as punishment, but as preparation. You're on that journey now. And what makes it so difficult is not the pain itself, although the pain is real. What makes it difficult is the absence of guarantees. Genuine transformation doesn't come with promises. You don't know exactly who you'll be when you emerge from the other side. You don't know which relationships will survive your move. You don't know which parts of your current life will continue to make sense after you become more fully yourself. And that lands because you spent your whole life trying to control how others felt about you, trying to be predictable enough, pleasant enough, helpful enough that love wouldn't be taken away. Symbolic death requires you to relinquish that control. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, organically, in the same way that a tree loses its leaves in autumn. Not as a sign of death, but as a preparation for a spring that has not yet arrived, but is absolutely certain. Well, Jung wrote that personality development is one of the most thankless and courageous tasks that a human being can undertake. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires you to face the very thing you have been most afraid of all your life. The possibility of being fully yourself, with no guarantees that it will be accepted. The old identity will die. Maybe it's already dying as you read this. And this is sacred, not despite the pain, because of her. The silence that comes after the storm, and the name it bears. There is a silence that most people never experience, not the silence of the absence of noise, not the silence of empty solitude that hurts, not the silence of those who are waiting for something to happen so that life finally begins. There is a silence that comes after the crisis, after the dissolution, after the inner storm that has lasted for years, perhaps decades, finally begins to lose its strength. Not because you have overcome it by force of will, but because you have stopped fighting it. Jung called this space the field of the self. The self in Jungian psychology is different from the ego. The ego is the part of you that thinks, that plans, that worries, that negotiates with the world, that builds the persona, that manages the shadow. The self is something much older and much quieter. It is the organizing center of the entire psyche. It is the part of you that knew, even when the ego was panicking, that there was a way, that there was a purpose, that there was a direction, even if invisible, even if painful, even if completely incomprehensible to the rational mind. And when the storm passes, what remains is not empty. It is this field. It has a very specific texture. Anyone who has ever touched it, even for a moment, recognizes it immediately. It is a peace that does not depend on external circumstances. It is a clarity that does not need validation. It is a way of knowing that does not pass through thought, but that is more certain than anything that thought has ever produced. For a soul who has spent years in emotional hypervigilance, always monitoring the environment, always adjusting, always carrying what was not theirs. Coming to this silence is an experience that has no equivalent in any external achievement. Because for the first time, you're not feeling it on behalf of anyone. It's just feeling. It's just being. It's just here. The journey to that silence is rarely straightforward. It passes through the shadow. When it goes through symbolic death, it goes through moments of such profound disorientation that you question everything you believed about yourself, about the world, about what it means to live well. But these moments are not obstacles in the way. They are the way. Jung observed that patients who came to genuine individuation, those who truly achieved a deeper integration of themselves, invariably went through a period that he described as the dark night of the soul, a period of apparent loss of meaning, of the collapse of the old structures, of a kind of existential vacuum that, to the anxious mind, looks like catastrophe, but to the deep psyche is simply the space necessary for something new to emerge. You may be tonight now. And what I want you to know, with all the precision that this knowledge allows, is that the night doesn't last forever. And the silence that comes after it is not the absence of something. It is the presence of yourself, finally, without the layers, without the mass, without the weight of what was not yours. This silence has a name. Jung called it individuation. Spiritual traditions call it awakening. You can call it whatever you want, but when you find it, you'll recognize it, because it will seem, for the first time in a long time, that you have arrived home. Who you become when you stop needing the world's approval. There is a version of you that has not yet fully appeared, not because it doesn't exist, because it has always existed, but because all this time she was waiting, hoping that the environment would be safe enough, hoping that the people around him would understand enough, and hoping that the pain would subside sufficiently, hoping that someone at some point would look at you with enough recognition that you finally felt empowered to be entirely real. This authorization will never come from outside, not because the people around you are evil or incapable of loving you, but because the authorization you're waiting for doesn't exist outside of you. It never existed. And the most liberating understanding that a sensitive soul can achieve, perhaps the most painful as well, is exactly this. You have been waiting for a permission that only you can give yourself. Jung described the process of individuation as a journey toward wholeness. Not to perfection, which is a fantasy of the ego. Totality is different. Totality means integrating what has been rejected. It means making peace with the shadow. And it means recognizing that you don't have to be consistently nice, consistently available, consistently strong to deserve to take up space in the world. It means realizing that you already deserve this space, not for what you do, not for what you carry, not because of how much you care, simply for existing. For a soul who grew up believing that his worth was tied to his usefulness to others, this realization does not come as a soft revelation. It arrives as a collapse of an entire structure. Because if your value doesn't depend on how much you care, what happens to all the years you annulled yourself to care? If you deserve space simply for existing, what does all the time you apologize for existing mean? It doesn't mean that you missed those years. It means that they went to school. The private school, one impossible to find anywhere else, that taught you with surgical precision the cost of living disconnected from yourself. And this learning, as painful as it was, is exactly what makes the version you're becoming irreversible. Because you're not transforming yourself by theory, it is transforming itself by lived experience. The soul that goes through all this and emerges on the other side is not the same as the one that entered. You are no longer manipulable by the fear of rejection because you have already survived the most fundamental rejection of all, the one you have imposed on yourself for years. He is no longer controllable by the threat of loneliness because he has learned that there is a loneliness that burns, that of being surrounded by people and not being seen, and a loneliness that nourishes, that of being with oneself without having to flee. It is no longer vulnerable to external approval because it has found something much more stable within itself. Who you become when you stop needing the world's approval is not a colder version. It's not a harsher version. It's not a version that has learned not to feel. It's a version that feels as much as you've always felt, but that is no longer lost in feeling, who loves deeply but does not dissolve into the other, who genuinely cares but from abundance and not scarcity, who is present with people without having to carry what belongs to them. Jung called this mature love, the love that only becomes possible after the individual has found a real relationship with himself, because you can only offer the other what you first found within yourself. And here, at this point, after everything that has been said, after everything that has been felt throughout this video, I want to tell you something with all the clarity that this moment allows. The journey you are taking, this descent inward, this silent death of what you have been, this slow and courageous return to yourself, is the most important journey there is. Not because it will make your life easier, but because it will make it more his own. And one day, not too far away, you will look back and understand that every moment of pain was exactly necessary, that each loss was a preparation, that each dark night was the preface to a clarity you could not yet imagine. You're coming home. And this time, you're coming in as yourself.